This is a quick remake, actually, of the Staircase murder, in my opinion on it. This is the Michael Peterson case from North Carolina in December 2001, where his wife, Kathleen Peterson, was found dead in pools of blood and blood spatter along the lower half of the walls of the entrance way to the back staircase. And the reason why I'm remaking it, just to say, I kept calling her Lacey Peterson, and unfortunately, because that's another interesting but tragic murder case, where actually I might do a video on that one, because although everyone's got it in for the husband, he's got a very good alibi. And I believe he was tried and convicted purely on the basis of adultery rather than evidence of murder, but that will be a controversial opinion. But this one, going to stick to the facts, and might as well start out, do I think Michael Peterson, the husband, did it? Was it an accident? Was it an intruder? Was it suicide? Well, let's look at the evidence in this case. So what happened was, this is according to Michael Peterson, had been drinking that evening, so only 2 bottles of wine were consumed between them. They had one of these old colonial style kind of houses, and they'd been out the back. I think they had a swimming pool there and stuff. No, nice house. And they'd been drinking this wine, and it was getting later and later and later. And apparently, maybe, I don't know, maybe about midnight or something, Kathleen decides to go in and reply to a work email that she needed to do. Whereas Michael, the husband, stays outside, carries on drinking and whatnot. And about 2:30 in the morning, he goes on in and he finds his wife at the bottom of the staircase, and there's blood everywhere. And he calls the police and says, "My wife has fallen down the stairs," which is kind of a strange thing to say, actually. If you find someone at the bottom of the staircase, but there's blood everywhere, including spatter, you'd have to be a bit of an idiot to think they fall down the stairs. Just as a very quick digression, though, look, if you fall over and smash your head and it's bad, yeah, there might be some blood ultimately dribbling out and making a pool and stuff. But if there's blood spatter, and if there's a large amount of blood, you do not, or you should not, assume that is an accident. I've fallen and cracked my skull before. There was no blood. I didn't, because I didn't remember. I don't even know where I slipped and fell. It's not certain. There was no blood. So, this kind of blood spatter clearly was an attack. And there was a serial killer. He was actually born in England, but he did his dastardly work in Australia. I believe it was in one of the suburbs of Sydney. His name was John Glover, and he was known as the Pie Man, because what he'd do, he'd go to old people's homes delivering meat pies, and he'd keep a hammer tucked into his trousers, and for some reason he liked bludgeoning old ladies, and so he would find old ladies walking around on their Zimmer frames and whatnot, and then he'd bash them, as the Australians say. We'd say bludgeon them with this hammer multiple times. And the problem was, the police would come to a scene, because the ambulance crew would say, "Hey, this is suspicious," and they'd always find that the blood had been cleaned up. There was no crime scene, because residents, helpful do-gooders and workers and so on would say, "Oh no, one of the ladies has had a bad fall and there's blood and we don't want it to upset anyone." And they'd just get to work and clean it up. And even one lady, who as well as being bludgeoned had actually been strangled too. She had her tights tightly knotted around her neck. The police officer was just incredulous by this point, because they had about 5 murders and not had a single crime scene, because it kept getting cleaned up before they got there. And he's like, "Why did you think there was something tied around her neck and yet you weren't suspicious? You saw that." And the unsuspecting sort of care staff, lady care worker, said, "Oh, I thought she was using them as neck warmers." Unbelievable. So yeah, this blood spatter clearly was no accident. But maybe Michael Peterson didn't know that. But either way, that's what he said on the phone to emergency services. And of course they arrived, and what they noticed immediately is that the blood was dry. She'd been there a long time. I don't think they could precisely say how long, but I think it was a minimum of 90 minutes, probably longer. And so anyway, what happened was Michael Peterson was arrested for murder. If I didn't say already, this was December 2001. But he did his appeals and all these kinds of things. And then 2008, finally, he had the opportunity to get out. And the reason was, it turned out there was the most disgraceful prosecutorial misconduct in this case. So in discovery, they hadn't given up certain exculpating evidence. They'd only sort of let the defence see what they wanted to see. But the most important thing, the key witness was the blood spatter analyst guy. And this blood spatter analyst was an absolute idiot. So it was the prosecution's contention that Kathleen had been bludgeoned. So I might as well describe her wound. She had 7 lacerations to the back and the top of her head, and they said she'd been hit with a blunt object. And they said that the blunt object used was something called a blow poke, which is this sort of light metal sort of hollow tube that you would use on your fireplace. So we had a real fireplace there in this old house, and you could blow air into it to kind of get oxygen into the fire and fire it up more. And they said that was a murder weapon. Well, this guy had found the blowpoke. It turned out, this all got revealed with the appeals, he'd found the blowpoke, he tested it, there was no blood on it, there were no dents on it, there was no evidence whatsoever it had been used as a murder weapon. And so they'd given it back to the family. And so this thing turned up in 2008, and they said, look, this is the blowpoke, you know, why are you saying that's the murder weapon when you knew quite well it wasn't? And so basically the prosecution knew that look, Michael Peterson was still the most likely person to have done it, but they had to obviously spell out their story and their scenario of how they think it happened. And clearly their theory was wrong. And more importantly, though, they had lied, and they'd knowingly lied. Whether that was just the blood spatter guy, probably not, it's pretty more than him. There was other things. So as I said, not revealing evidence in discovery. Also, he was using presumptive tests for blood and saying they were blood. Then he'd send them off to a lab to actually check, is it definitely blood? Because a presumptive test, a field test, is not 100% reliable. There's lots of things that can cause a false positive, so you send it to the lab to double check it. He was getting letters or emails or whatever they had in 2001 back saying, now that thing you thought was blood, it wasn't, it was this, that and the other, it was a meat pie, it was you know, some bleach on it, or whatever. And he wasn't handing those in. He was just going off his presumptive tests and either ignoring, because he was lazy, or deliberately ignoring, because he was corrupt, these bits of evidence. So basically, they had to, the prosecution had to accept, look, our case was dodgy, it has to go back for another trial. However, you've already served, 7 years or whatever it was in jail. If you say you're guilty, we'll let you out on time served. And this is what he did. He copped an Alford plea, which means you're saying, I'm innocent, I didn't do it. However, the prosecution has enough evidence that I potentially could be convicted. Therefore, I'll cop this Alford plea. And that's what he did. So he got out. So everyone's happy, really. The prosecution can go away and say, yeah, well, we got the right man. He was guilty, he admitted it. And he can, Peterson can go out and say, no, I did, I'm totally innocent. Don't want to go to the lottery of a jury again. So that's what happened. That's what he got out. Going back to the crime scene, though, it's very, very interesting. And very unusual, because almost always when you're fatally bludgeoned over the head, there's a couple of things that we notice. Firstly, you would usually have a fractured skull, but what you'd certainly have as well is bleeding on the brain. So it's one of the linings of the brain will be torn, and there'll be bleeding between the membranes. You've got the arachnoid layer, the dura mater, and then the pia mater. Those are the three, pia being the one that's like wafer thin attached to the skull. Dura mater is the thicker one in the middle, and then arachnoid just below the skull. And there was no hemorrhaging of any of the membranes. there was no damage in the brain. So, you can have a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and it will cause pressure to build up between the skull, which is solid, and the brain, and so it will compress the brain, and it will cause brain damage. Or you can actually have hemorrhaging that's deeper and runs into the brain. But when they did their autopsy, there was no evidence of sort of bleeding in the brain damage. And that was really unusual. And the defence, ultimately, in their appeal, was able to use this and say, look, this could easily have just been an accident. If it had been a proper bludgeoning that took place, there would have been this brain injury. And they cited nearly 400 other examples in, I presume, as North Carolina's sort of jurisdiction. And they said every single one of these of a bludgeoning death, we had either a fractured skull or bleeding on the brain or both, this kind of thing. And that it was peculiar, and it is peculiar. The other thing that the defence was able to say, there's no cast-off blood. Now, if you don't know, cast-off blood is when you bash someone on the head and then it bleeds, and then you hit them again. Obviously, then your weapon gets bloody, and as you raise it to strike again, you fling blood off it, and so you'll see bloody, patch of blood spots in a line streaked across the ceiling. And what you can do, you can count how many streaks of blood, these blood droplets on the ceiling, and then you add one, and then that should correspond to the number of wounds on the head. And it usually works mathematically like that. Excuse me. And there was no cast-off blood here. The blood all appeared to be spattered either on the lower part of the walls and loads of it on the floor. And that, unfortunately, I haven't seen photographs of Kathleen Peterson's skull. Why do I want to look at that? Am I a sadist or something? No. I'd like to see what those wounds look like, because they tell you the trajectory, if there was one, of the weapon. Was she being struck from top to bottom, or was she being struck sideways? Because it would be possible to do your cast-off sideways if you're swinging it like a baseball bat, whatever the weapon is. The other peculiar thing, though, is that they couldn't find a murder weapon. It sounds like this, blood spatter analyst was doing everything he could to find something that was a murder weapon, and in the end had to go for one that obviously wasn't. So was this murder so well planned that Michael Peterson, if he was indeed the killer, had time to hide it? I don't think so, because one thing that was noted is that there was a very botched attempt to try and clean up some of the blood, perhaps to make it look like more of an accident, so what we call staging. And, by the way, just to say, staging is when you try and make something look like a different kind of crime or something innocent like a suicide when it's really a murder or whatever. Posing is when you move the body into perhaps a provocative position or a humiliating position, like Danny Rowling used to do the Gainesville Ripper. Very lewd. Don't muddle that up. Too many people that should know better should know the difference between staging and posing. Anyway, that's a digression. I've forgotten what I was saying now. There was a hasty attempt to clean up. There was like some kitchen roll or something similar down there in the hallway. And it seemed like someone had a little rub to try and get rid of some of the blood, and then just realised, actually, this is never going to work. There's too much of that. And they'd stopped. Now, those are peculiar things. So we've got definite prosecutorial misconduct. Absolutely disgraceful. I should just add, American prosecutors, I can't stand them as a rule. And probably the same with the CPS in this country for the most part as well. When you look at what they did to Michael Stone, convicting of the Chillenden murders when the only evidence they had was pointing away from him, they don't give a damn that there's a double murderer running around. But that's another story for another day. They can get a conviction. That's all they care about. And that's the phrase they use, is there a realistic prospect of conviction? It's not, is this person innocent or guilty? No, it's, is there a realistic prospect of conviction? And this is what they do in America, even more an extent. It's almost like, they compete against one another to say, I've got a 100% record of convictions. And, they really irritate me, just not caring about the lives that they're ruining and the lives they're taking in states like Texas when they send innocent men sometimes to their deaths, because it does happen. Believe me. I mentioned Lacey Peterson. Her husband was convicted on the basis of adultery, not on any evidence of murder. Now, I'm not saying he didn't do it. He probably did. But there was a definite reasonable doubt if you're actually intelligent enough to understand the alibi, which was activity on his computer, black and white. He was using his computer at the time of the murder. It's a pretty strong alibi. But anyway, we don't need to get into that. And also they lied about, I very briefly get into it. Supposedly he had got a boat purely for the purposes of, hiding a body in the harbour there. He'd had lots of boats over his life. This was not a special boat just for murder. And yeah, that's how it was put to the by the prosecution to the jury. So they were misled. And thankfully his sentence has been commuted from the death sentence to life imprisonment. And we'll wait. I'm not saying he's innocent. I'm just saying that when your goal purely is to convict, and I've heard police officers say that, we decide sometimes with our guts, within a couple of minutes, in 30 seconds, whether we think the suspect is innocent or guilty. And if they think they're guilty, they're going to home in on that person, aren't they? And that's the problem with the system, where people don't understand you need to provide evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay. Anyway, so going back to this one, why do I think, what do I think and why do I think it? The weather, it was December 2001. It was freezing there. I'm trying to do my Fahrenheit to Celsius. Do you times it by 2, take away 40? It was cold, let's put it that way. It wasn't far off freezing. And I find it hard to believe that they would be outside, and particularly Michael Peterson would be outside dressed in shorts and T-shirt. I know they've been drinking, and that makes you less sensitive to temperature. This is why if you go to sleep on a bus stop when you're drunk, you might wake up dead with hypothermia. I realise that's an oxymoron. But it's true. So they have been drinking, had a bottle of wine each, yeah. So I don't believe he was out there and, in the cold, dressed like that until 2:30 in the morning. I think it's highly, highly unlikely. And that's one thing I've learned from the Unsolved No More channel with the cold case investigator, the real one. And he always looks at the weather, and it can be revealing, like it was with Bridge Guy, all wrapped up there when the girls were lightly clad, So there was that. However, in terms of the falling down the stairs thing, let's cut to the chase. Now, she drank a bottle of wine, Kathleen had. The blood alcohol was pretty high, and she'd been taking Valium, which is a benzodiazepine, it's diazepam. And if you've ever taken diazepam, it makes you woozy. And it also causes situationally elevated risk. So let's say there was a knock at the door by some unknown person. Whereas normally you might call through, who is it? Maybe, if your inhibitions are lowered by diazepam, you might just swing it open and say, come join the party. Potentially. However, the defence's theory, and this is sort of what they use to get the appeal and stuff, does to me sound somewhat preposterous. They can tell by the blood spatter that she was either attacked, if she was attacked, or fell, whatever, on the hallway, just in there in the hallway, at the bottom of the stairs. The highest she could have been would have been 2 steps up the staircase. They said, well, she was woozy and drowsy, like we said, drunk, whatever. She'd gone up a couple of steps, and she fell back and hit her head on that knobbly thing at the bottom of the staircase, like a metal knobbly thing that probably has a real name that I don't know. I presume there was blood on that, her blood, or I don't think the defence could have used it. Although, again, I don't know that for sure. But here's the thing, she had 7 lacerations. So they said, well, presumably she got to her feet, realised she needed to lie down, need to go upstairs to bed, whatever. And she slipped again and hit her head again, maybe on the floor this time. And then, gets to her feet, realises she's hurt, slips over again. Now, to make 7 lacerations, even if you're being generous, you've got to fall quite a few times. And that, it's just preposterous, isn't it? Really. The other rather amusing theory is that there's a serial killing owl on the loose in North Carolina, because there was a little bit of feather in her hair and apparently a little bit of twig or something. And so maybe she opened the door and was attacked by an owl. And an owl tore her scalp to ribbons. And she bled to death, or just the blunt force trauma of an owl hitting her over and over again is what killed her. It's clearly preposterous as well. I mean, look, I don't put my fingers in bird cages, because even a budgerigar can give you a painful peck. And I'm sure an owl could do a lot worse as well. I know from reading Harry Potter that an owl bite isn't very nice. Although they will take an Avada Kedavra curse if you're being attacked by Voldemort, so that's the good side of them. But no, there's no murderous owls flying around. She would have undoubtedly reached up and done some serious harm to the owl if she was being beaten about the head with its wings and scratched by its talons. There wouldn't have just been some microscopic, furry, feathery little bits in her hair. There would have been bits and pieces of owl everywhere as well, because you're fighting for your life against this bird that's attacking you. So that's preposterous. Yeah, this theory they put forward. Now, what do I think happened? Well, what we haven't said about Michael Peterson, he was bisexual, and he had been communicating with a male escort. So, on his computer, there were email communications where he had been arranging to meet up with a male escort. Now, if we believe Michael Peterson, Kathleen had gone inside a couple of hours before to send a work email, and they used the same computer upstairs. How do we know that Michael hadn't forgotten to log out of his email, and Kathleen had gone in there, opened it up? It was his email to the male escort right there in front of her. And she'd been like, what the hell is this? Yeah. And at trial, Peterson tried to claim, or the defence tried to claim, that, oh, she knew all about this and she didn't have a problem with it and stuff, you know. Okay, if you're very gullible and naive, you might believe that, but I don't. What wife wouldn't have a problem with their husband doing that kind of thing, you know, when you got children and all the rest of it, and, you know, you're off to meet a male prostitute? No, I'm sure she had a big problem with it. I'd imagine that's the first she heard of it. Or maybe she told him off about this kind of thing before and he promised never to do it again. I don't know. So I believe she came down those stairs to confront him. This clearly was not a planned event. You know, there was no... You know, the hurried little bit of a clean-up and the just the violent anger and the inability to find a murder weapon. For me, I believe this was a sudden rush of anger and violence. And so I believe, turning possibilities into probabilities, the most probable thing is she's there shouting from the stairs, what the hell is this? Or she rushes out there and drags him and wants to show him the email. And he, you know, for whatever reason, turns on her, either in the hallway or just on the first step or two. Maybe she slapped him. Who knows? Why is there no murder weapon? If he was smart enough to stash the murder weapon or clean the murder weapon in such a way it was never found, I think they'd have found it. Or rather... kind of contradicts itself, didn't it? I think if he's that smart, he's smart enough to have planned the murder properly, or at least done a proper clean-up after. He wouldn't have left some kitchen roll lying around and smeared blood where he tried to clean it up, you know. And he had time. You know, he didn't call the police for a long time after this happened. He could have waited till the next day if he wanted. He could have pretended he slept in the garden and had time to clean up a lot more. So it doesn't add up that he carefully found a secret hidey hole for the weapon. Doesn't work, or that he cleaned it so perfectly. I don't believe that. Also, why is there no skull fractures and stuff like we said? And also, why is there no cast-off? My theory is this, that if you're right in front of someone and they're in your face and they're shouting at you, do you then rush off to the kitchen and grab a knife, or do you rush to the living room, grab your blowpoke, or, you know, rush to your closet and grab a baseball bat. I don't think so. I think what you do is you just grab their head and bash it on that knobbly thing on the stairs, that metal thing. So I don't think there is a murder weapon. I think he did it with his bare hands in a fit of anger. That makes perfect sense. She's marching up the stairs saying, "Follow me. Look what I've found." He just grabs her and bashes her head on the knobbly thing. And then she falls to the bottom of the stairs. She clearly gets up because her footprints were found in blood. Her bare footprints were in the blood. So she's got to her feet. And then, whatever happens, she gets 6 more blows or lacerations or whatever. And this would explain why there's no cast off. You know, maybe just grabs her and bash her head on the floor. And I don't know how hard or soft the floor was, but maybe, you know, it was sufficient to badly tear her skin, but not enough to break her skull. I don't know, it would depend. It would depend on looking at that knobbly thing, looking at the wounds, looking at the floor to make a decision on that. And obviously I haven't seen those reports, so I don't know. But I'm just trying to explain, you see, how there's no cast off, how there's no blood spatter very high on the walls, and how he doesn't have blood spatter on his top. He has blood all over his shorts, Peterson does, and on his feet and sandals and whatnot, but nothing high. And that, to me, would explain it. If he's over her, you know, maybe sort of squatting over almost, just banging her head on the floor. How does she die, though, without any brain injury, without any skull fracture? That's a bit perplexing. But given the amount of blood there, is it not just possible that she bled out? And so, although the cause of death by the medical examiner was blunt force trauma, yeah, it is possible to, well, I say it's possible to cause, yes, it's possible to cause trauma to the brain without physically breaking the skull or whatever. I mean, look at, you know, certain boxers that have suffered severe brain damage when there's no damage to the skull. It's that concussive force. But I would have thought that even in 2001, the scans they would do, MRI scans and so on, surely that would show a concussive brain injury. I'd have to look into that, actually. If there's no bleed, would it show just the concussion to the skull? I don't know, sorry, even though I'm a pharmacist. It was a long time ago I was at the hospital looking at brain scans, and I've forgotten how much we can see there. Can you diagnose concussion and traumatic sort of brain injury, concussive brain injury, with a brain scan? I suspect you can, but actually I'd have to look into that, so apologies, that's something we check after. But whatever. So blood loss, maybe the concussion, if that doesn't show up. But that, to me, would explain everything. So there was no murder weapon. It was bare hands, and then the floor, or the knobbly thing on the stairs, was the murder weapon. What's also possible, though, is that there was an intruder. An intruder did it. She might have answered the door. But, of course, if he attacked her over the head, then you'd think there'd be cast off, wouldn't you? Cast off blood, which there wasn't. But again, it's possible that the manner in which he swung was not up and down. Maybe it was like a baseball swing. That is possible. So the other thing I guess we should very briefly touch on is that years before, he'd been over in Germany. I think he was a US Marine. Obviously have a base in Germany and that Ramstein Air Base and stuff, and I don't know about the Marines if they're there, but they have bases in Germany, don't they, on NATO thing. Anyway, a girl was found dead. His good friend, someone called Ratcliffe, I believe, his surname was found dead at the bottom of the staircase. Does that bear any relevance to this? Yes and no. I mean, her cause of death was put down, I believe, as a hemorrhagic stroke. Just either way, it was not a suspicious death. The police investigated, and in their police report, they said there was no blood. However, in the Netflix documentary, I am told, they got witnesses say, "Oh, there's blood everywhere," but the police said there wasn't. So who do you believe? I tend to believe the German police. I think they're rather efficient. But either way, if they put it down as a natural cause of death, the only relevance to me, I don't think that was murder. Going by what the police said and did. The only relevance to me is that he's seen a girl dead before at the bottom of a staircase. And so, after he's just had this great volcanic rage, beaten his wife to death, and he's thought what to do, and he's been pondering and thinking it over, and waits, over an hour, and he finally thinks, yeah, the best thing to do is to call this in, rather than try and clean it up. Call it in, and just say, well, it's like what happened before. She's fallen down the stairs, and she's dead. But of course, the difference here was all the blood. I think that was all the stuff that I wanted to talk about on this video. So if you got to the end of it, thanks for listening. I haven't watched all of the Netflix documentary. I sort of done with this one, because to me it's a fairly open and shut case. It's almost certain that he did it. The only thing is, it'd be nice to know precisely how, but he obviously is not going to talk, because his... I don't know if they're his children, actually. Or they might be stepchildren, because I think he adopted the kids of the Ratcliffe friend after she tragically died at the bottom of the staircase. But either way, he's not going to tell us anything, because they all believe he's innocent. Most probably he isn't innocent. And, but there's not really any evidence he's guilty either, beyond the circumstances. And like I said, with the Laci Peterson case, just because, this guy was, arranging a male escort. Yeah, that's a reason for a massive argument and potentially a fatal, attack. But with the other Peterson case, the Laci Peterson one, he was basically convicted on the fact he was a bit of a scumbag with men. Not with men, sorry, with women in his case. His wife was pregnant, quite heavily pregnant, and he was out, seeing other girls, seeing women and stuff. He was a ladies' man, and, he was living basically a double life. He had this lovely wife, really attractive, got a child on the way, and he's off seeing women. So I guess in the biblical sense of things, he's guilty either way. Murder, adultery, all goes in the same kind of hand, but you still get stoned, if you're, under the Mosaic law. But, but in our modern justice system, not the case. You can't be convicted of adultery and sentenced to death as he initially was. So again, it's a case of, on the evidence, not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But, yeah, probably did it. Anyway, thanks for listening.